Hey everyone, I want to talk about tags. And for anyone who's not familiar with tags in ICRPG, essentially what they are little keywords or verbal cues that you can use to provide narrative detail or descriptive detail to an item, a person, a place, a thing, a monster. Really, anything can be tagged. But what's cool about tags is they may or may not include specific mechanics, like say abilities do. And so I've got ICRPG Core 2nd Edition here because tags weren't included in Master Edition. Although you can kind of see traces of them everywhere, and everything that's in Core is completely compatible with Master Edition, so you can totally use tags if you're playing Master Edition. But I really think that they were left out because it's more of a optional or stylized approach to adding detail to things within the game, and rather than say a hard fast rule set or whatever. But I've got some items and things that I want to tag and show you kind of how they work. And so you're first introduced to tags when you're picking out items in 2nd edition. And so I've got it open here to our ancient weapons for like a fantasy game or whatever. And I've pulled out a longsword. So my character wants to play maybe a knight with a longsword. And so when I'm picking out my item, you'll actually see the description for a longsword is it's considered a mark of lordship in many places. That's great, whatever that can play into my character's backstory. But then right here, I've got 3 tags, deadly, large, and sharp. So I'm just going to add those in real quick to my card. And so we'll say deadly, large, and sharp. Okay. So I've now tagged this sword with 3 keywords, deadly, large, and sharp. And if I look at the next page, I've got some descriptions of what that actually means. So the first one is deadly. Has a tendency to slay its victims with terrible haste. That's it. That's the whole description. And so now when I'm using the sword, I can take that into play with my actions, with my RP, or, like I said, tags may or may not include specific mechanics. I could play that into maybe a moment of granting easy when we're trying to finish off an enemy. Or maybe I could include a specific mechanic, like say this weapon does ultimate, or it does, double weapon, or something like that. And then the next one is large, which is simply more than an arm's length. So this weapon is more than an arm's length. Maybe that means I can attack things that are near to me. Maybe it's just harder, it's more noticeable, it's harder to conceal, things like that. It's more difficult to use in tight spaces. And then the last one is sharp. So the last one, particularly destructive against objects, ropes, cloth, or wood. So maybe in this case, when I'm using this weapon against a rope, I can say it's easy, or it's going to do double effort, or it's going to just cut through in a single blow, or you don't need a check. You can see how just a simple descriptive approach to tags implies potential use cases where this can come up. And what also it does is it allows me to customize this basic sword to fit my players or to fit this situation. So for example, I could say instead of, let's pull this back, and I'm going to get rid of sharp, and let's say instead I'm going to give it the tag heavy. Okay. Now this sword, even though it has deadly and large, it's now heavy instead of sharp. What heavy does is an awful on high gravity worlds can cause fatigue on a journey. Okay, so now why is this sword so heavy? Maybe it's made of a really heavy metal. Maybe it's something that picked up from a giant and now the player wants to carry it around and use it. Sure, we can totally do that, but it gets the heavy tag. So it could be kind of a detriment or a disadvantage to use, but it adds narrative detail. And we can keep doing that with other things as well. So instead of deadly, what we can do is we can say it's rare. Maybe this is a single-use item. Maybe instead of large, we can say it's intimidating, which says yelling with this in your hand will cause quite an effect. So again, it's narrative. It allows you to play into the mechanics when the moment arises. And so we got all sorts of things like that. Now, what I also really like about tags, and what I find personally really useful for them, is it allows me to develop a personal library of keywords that I can use consistently with myself and with players. So I want to look at a monster here. So this is just my skeleton warrior, and obviously these weapon tags aren't going to be as useful to me because I'm describing a monster. Maybe I can use these for inspiration, but how can I tag a monster? For me, one of the common tags that I use is undead. Okay, now that's a pretty common way of describing monsters, but for me, when I tag something as undead, it kind of implies a couple things for me. It implies that this creature may have rot, which if they hit, it can prevent players from healing. Or perhaps they are, susceptible to healing. So to hurt an undead in my games, occasionally I'll allow healing spells to do damage against them. Or lastly, I usually have undead have draining powers. So they'll drain players of their stats or their effort or not just their HP. And so for me, this undead tag means specifically these things. And as I use them consistently, my players will also pick up on this is undead, which clues them into these mechanics. Additionally, I might say something like this is fragile, which means they're not going to take big, heavy hits a lot. They're kind of mooky. They're, one-hit wonders, right? They're fragile. They might break, or they might be more susceptible to bashing or weapons rather than, say, a range weapon like an arrow. Okay. And then finally, I do things like it's a horde. So I'll tag this as a horde, and that usually means that they have +1 to their stat, but for every skeleton in the group, they stack. So for example, if you had 10 skeletons in the group, that whole group is going to get 1 action, and it's going to be +10, which is pretty scary. And that's just a consistent way for me to describe hordes. So now I've tagged my monster in this way, and for me, it develops that consistency. But let's look at perhaps a place. Okay. Again, you can use these tags to describe narrative detail and just clue them in. So for example, this is my Scarlet Monolith moment, my drawing or whatever, and I might tag this with energy. So there's energy going along. You can feel it in the air. You can, maybe it implies that magic does extra bits, or it goes wild magic, or things like that. But there's a high amount of energy in this space, right? And I can use that to describe my encounter and use it to kind of influence what type of things happen in the scene. Perhaps it is lost. I don't know. The Scarlet Monolith in my game, or at least in Off Marches, and the way I imagine it is that this thing is kind of a lost treasure or a lost relic or a location that once you find it, it's in an obscure place, right? But then what I can do is I can also say that it's ancient. Okay, it's really old. Everything around it is crumbling, covered with vines. Everything around it is, has signs of ancient civilizations, and I can use that tag to play into my descriptions as we're playing the game, all with a simple tag. And I can kind of develop a feel for what does it mean to be ancient or lost, or everything like that. And I can always change these things, like I said, with so lost, instead it is risky. So it's perilous. It's some place that is going to take some effort to get to, and whatever. And then finally, we got, say, a person. Again, your NPCs are great targets for tags because they're going to interact with them more often, and you can tag them with different statuses. So, for example, one that I usually do is friendly or hostile. Now, pretty common one. I'm not saying that's unique by any ways, but if I tagged an NPC with friendly, then they don't have to use charisma to convince them to help. They can just ask and they'll help. Or if they're hostile, it's like, no, they're going to be actively working against them. Or they might be neutral. A neutral NPC is someone who doesn't care one way or the other, and players might have to convince them to help, and if they fail, they might turn hostile and go friendly or hostile. Additionally, they might have, the tag expert in a particular thing. So this I often use this card for an archaeologist or someone who's a treasure hunter. And so she's an expert in the lore of loot and items, and so she might be able to tell players where a rare piece of treasure is, or identify something, or whatever. And so she's an expert rather than just, say, a commoner. And then I might tag her as, I might tag her as rich. Maybe she does. She doesn't. She's has plenty of money. Maybe she's a quest giver. And so now she constantly has quests for players, or we can say that she's, in trouble. And so again, these are all just descriptive keywords that allow me to describe things consistently throughout my game, and I can switch them out as things progress without writing up a whole backstory of whatever about who this person is, all these details. I can just tag them, look at them quickly, have them in my journal, and we're good to go. And so you can see here that there's really no limit to tags when it comes to using them. What I often see is when tags come up in conversations, it's usually you are looking for specific mechanics. And you can totally do that. You can totally add in specific mechanics, or you look for a list of things. But just like with anything, it's kind of up to you how you play these. And this is why it's kind of like a stylized approach. The style of game that I like to play is I like tags, because I don't want to come up with specific mechanics the entire time. I want to be able to kind of interpret things on the fly, which what tags naturally allow you to do. But you can see here there's some of these things that allow you to do specific mechanics. So like, for example, ranged fire, rapid fire. On a natural 20, when fired, you can roll for a second attack. That's a blatant direct mechanic. That's great, totally works. And so whether you choose to figure out specific mechanics or just be descriptive with your tags, all I recommend is when you're using these, make them your own. Make your own library of tags. Come up with something that makes sense to you and that you can be consistent with your players, and they'll start learning them too. And that's where the real power of tags come from, is a word library that means something for you and that you can add in your game with ease. Eventually, all you have to write is fast to know that they move double far, that they take an extra action, they have an extra move, done. With one word, you add it into your journal, speeds up prep, and it's just in your memory bank and in your library of what tags are. So yeah, let me know how you use tags in your games. Try them out. Next time you hand out a sword, instead of just saying, here's a sword, give it a special tag, describe it to them, and see what your players do with them. And I guarantee that you'll find some fun use cases that will come from just a single keyword.